I'm the current vice president in charge of programs. So I want to welcome everybody tonight. I see the list of people, and I know that some of you aren't members and might not know about our organization. We have been an organization in Los Angeles, Chinatown since 1975. And we've been having monthly meetings starting in 1976. We went to Zoom fall of 2020, and it really is quite an outreach. It allows us to get stellar speakers like what we have tonight and to meet a lot of new people on Zoom. So I want to do the program push for the next few months and hope that you will come back. Normally, we are the first Wednesday of every month during the school year. However, we are being a community partner with China Society next month, and we will be the first Monday, which is April 3rd. And Li Ping Chen, who is a postdoctoral scholar and teaching fellow at USC at the East Asia Studies Center, will lead a panel discussion about Dr. Theodore Chen, who was a Chinese American scholar and a founder of the East Asian Studies Center at USC. And the next month, on May 4th, we have Professor Dudley Gardner, who is a professor of history at Wyoming Community College, and he has written and will be giving us a presentation about the Chinese in Wyoming. And then to end, before the summer, we have June 7th, we have Jessica Chu, and she has become very, very interested in her family's history, which part of it is here in Old Chinatown, but the bulk of her presentation will be what she has found about her family history in Red Bluff, California. So I hope that you will join us for all of these presentations. They will be online this evening. Presentation is being recorded. So that's the end of my portion. So I'd like to turn the meeting over to our president, Eugene Moy, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Gene?
Thank you, Susan. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining in. Many of you are friends, members, longtime friends, and I'm really always pleased to see you, even though some of you I haven't seen in person in quite a while, but I know that I see you month after month, and that's always what always warms my heart here to see that many of you are still around. Anyway, we have another great program for you tonight. We, as Susan has mentioned, we've been providing programs since 1975. That's more than 40 years, and we try to provide insight on our local community, but also on many of our brother and sister communities across the country. Ron Chu is really a native of a native of Seattle in Washington State, in the northwest corner of our country, which has been of interest to me personally. As many of you know, my grandfather was in Seattle. And I think some of you in the audience are really from the Northwest also. So I'm hoping to learn a little bit more about our Chinese American community, our Chinatown of Seattle, and really get an idea of what has made it tick over the generations. Ron is especially qualified to tell the story because he is from the neighborhood. A little bit of background: he's presently a principal of Chi Communications, which is a consulting firm based in the neighborhood, helps with community history work and with museums. And he's qualified to do that because he previously was executive director of the Wingloop Asian Museum in Seattle. And before that, he actually had some other experience with a number of organizations. He, let me get this, you know, it's a long list here, but let me just quickly run through it. He's been recognized for many things, for many achievements, accomplishments in the Seattle area. He had served on the Seattle Public Library Foundation Board of Directors. In 1998, they successfully completed their capital campaign, raising over raising over 80 million to build a new central library, and supported 27 neighborhood branch libraries. So that's very important work that's actually near and dear to many of us. In 2001, Ron was appointed to the National Council for the Humanities by President Bill Clinton. And along the way, he was a recipient of the Ford Foundation's Leadership for a Changing World Award and was named to the American Alliance of Museums Centennial Honor Roll. As I mentioned, he is a lifelong Seattle resident. He graduated from Franklin High School, attended the University of Washington, where he majored in journalism. I should also not neglect to mention that he's been the author of several books. His actually memoir published in 2020, My Unforgotten Seattle, is really what caught our eye, and this is why we're inviting him to speak tonight. But he's also written Reflections of Seattle's Chinese Americans, the First 100 Years, and also Remembering Silme, Domingo, and Viernes, the Legacy of Filipino American Labor Activism in the Seattle area. That was published in 2010. So Ron is really qualified to talk about a variety of subjects. And before we had just started, I had asked him, how long is your presentation? And his response was, well, as long as you want me to. And that gives you a little sense of his depth of knowledge of the Seattle community. So I'd like to now welcome to our March program meeting here, Ron Chu. Ron?
Thank you, Gene. Boy, where do I start? Such a grandiose introduction. I feel like I should just step off the stage and call it a night. What I thought I would do, and I am a journalist by training, so I don't like to go on and on. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible in the hopes that if there are questions that you'll ask them, there'll be time to ask them, and that hopefully you'll be inspired enough to get a copy of the book. I sent to Ricky Leo, who's my cohort in this, a series of images from my book. And so I was going to do a slide presentation, but you know, we do so many of these things that they get kind of boring. So, but I just want to run through a set of images. There are probably 10 to 12 images that encapsulate or give a flavor of what the book is all about. So I don't know, Ricky, do you want to pull up the PowerPoint? And again, I'll walk you through these images fairly quickly. Okay, so obvious. I wanted to really tell you a little bit about how I made this book. So there's lots of directions. I mean, it's a big book, 700 pages. I don't really want to go into all of it, but I did want to give you some clues as to how I actually wrote it, because I want to inspire all of you to consider writing your own memoir, whether it's just simply for family or to actually publish it. because it's actually not as complex as you may think. Do you want to move forward to the next one, Ricky? This is the cover of the book. Me posed by the restaurant in Seattle where I grew up working as a busboy from age 13 to 21, making some money so I could go to college as the first college educated generation in my family. Next. As I was writing this book, I thought about 3 truths, which I believe very strongly, and which guided my work. 3 years, that's how long it took me to research, write, and pull this thing together. There was an additional year of like editing and design, so probably about a 4-year project. 3 truths. First is that our richest heritage is still hidden in plain sight. That's why I realized that, you know, a lot of our history has not yet been written. And so I wanted to write it. Second truth is that history is made by ordinary people, not just the rich and famous. Those are the ones you read about, but it doesn't mean that folks around us who are unseen by the larger society aren't important. And so we would need to document that. The third truth was I realized anyone can write a memoir, even you. I'm a journalist by training, but I'm used to writing 800-word stories. This book is 700 pages. You know, little thing starts and it grows, and it can become a book. Next slide. So you see in the center of this map, the Toisan district. That's where a lot of us before the 1960s came from. So the story traces the arrival of my grandfather in 1911 all the way to America. Next. This is a wedding picture of my father and my mother and my maternal grandmother right after their wedding in 1937. Like many of the Chinese men who worked overseas, he went back to the village, got married, left her in China, went back to America to work, and they were separated for a period of time. I show this image partly because I asked my mother about the necklace she had and those bracelets and those earrings. I don't know if you could see in the image, but they were actually painted on in the studio. So she said, no, it doesn't exist. So anyway, the family heirloom was illusionary. Next. This is my father after he retired in a restaurant called the Thai Tung restaurant in the Chinatown area. He posed for an image. I interviewed him and my mother for the book which Jean referenced, Reflections of Seattle's Chinese Americans, First 100 Years. It includes oral histories of over 100 elders, of which I think 1 or 2 are still alive now. So it was a timely publication. The restaurant still exists in original form as one of the original chop suey restaurants in Chinatown. Next. This is my late uncle who fought in Italy, was killed during World War II. He was part of the 87th Infantry Division, fought in Italy. He never returned, but this image was sent back. A number of actually negatives were sent back to my father, and I developed them and began exploring more of his history. Next. This is my mother after she retired as a sewing woman, and this was her favorite place, the kitchen, cooking. You see that pot behind her? Back in the old days, people used to cook rice using a rice pot. We bought her a rice cooker, electric rice cooker, but she never used it. She thought it would like explode on her or something. So anyway, that's the kitchen. Next. That's us. I'm the one who's the second from the left. And I was chatting a little bit with Gene earlier, because he sent me some images of his family, and all of us who grew up as baby boomers in the 50s, 60s, wore the same kind of clothes and had the same type of images. Next. This is a restaurant, the Hong Kong restaurant where you saw that neon sign behind me on the cover of my book. This was a postcard that was taken, postcard image, I'm sorry, that captures what the interior looked like. Next. Silme, Domingo, and Viernes. Silme is on the left. On the right is Viernes. In the middle is one of the Filipino old timers. I hooked up with the two of them and helped with some of the cannery union reform efforts that they undertook, the class action lawsuits that they filed against the cannery companies in the 1970s for discrimination and segregation. And unfortunately, Silme and Gene were murdered in a complex plot involving Ferdinand Marcos and the martial law regime there. Next. This is where my grandfather, my father, my uncles, and a lot of Filipinos worked, is sliming and butchering salmon in the fish houses in Alaska. They were dispatched up there and dispatched from Seattle up to Alaska and then came back after the fishing season. Next. This is my mother in the sewing factory. This is what she did from 7 in the morning. She went to work at one factory, got off at 4, caught the bus, went to another job from 4:30 to 9, came home and cooked us dinner, and started all over again every day. Next. This is Wayne Luke, first Asian American City Council member in the Pacific Northwest, elected City Council in 1962. He's a namesake of the museum where I worked as director. And unfortunately, he died in a plane crash at a very young age. But the museum was inspired by his vision of having a museum that documented and preserved the legacy of Asian Americans in the region. Next. This is the second site of the Wayne Luke Museum. This is when I arrived at the museum in 1991, beginning. It's an old auto garage. So you can see the decorative design on the exterior. There's a theater in that in the middle of the image picture, and a florist shop on the left. The museum outgrew that space, and I was part of a capital campaign to redevelop a new site. Next. This is the first major exhibit we did on Executive Order 9066, which looked at the incarceration of Japanese Americans on the 50th anniversary of the event. And it was a very moving experience. We had some wonderful folks who were part of helping create the exhibit. I noticed in terms of the list of participants who are in this meeting, I believe Sadie Yamasaki. Sadie and her daughter, Sally, were very instrumental in helping work on this project. Anyways, Sally's picture is sort of tucked away in the middle there. Next. We worked with many communities. One of them was the Sikh community. It was a wonderful collaboration partnership that surfaced this hidden history of South Asian community in the region that had been in the Northwest for 100 years, but nobody had bothered to document their stories or really bring to light their achievements. So it's a wonderful partnership. It was the last exhibit, I believe, that I worked on before I left the museum. Next. I'm going to run through these images real quickly. This is the building which we redeveloped as the New Wing Luke Museum. It was built in 1910. That, why don't you go to the next image, Ricky? So that building, next image, Ricky. And then you could see the adjacent building. It's separated by Canton Alley. Those two buildings were originally developed by over 200 Chinese pioneers who pooled their money to build a community center and housing and associations for some of that first generation bachelors. And so we decided to develop the east building, the building on the left, and create a new museum. Next. You can see it today. We cleaned up the brick, fixed it up, and the building, that big building in the forefront, is the new Wing Luke Museum. If you haven't had a chance to visit it, you'll find it pretty amazing because we preserved a lot of the original interior and spaces and then opened it up, and it's now a museum. Next. There was a import-export business called the Yik Fung Company that was established right when the building was opened in 1910. We preserved it as a historical exhibit. The son of the original owner of the business deeded the business to the museum. We converted it into an exhibit. He passed away, he was close to 100 years old. So he hadn't changed really much of anything inside the space. So it's a wonderful opportunity to preserve something that he really felt belonged to the community and should be preserved as a legacy. Next. Back to the Japanese American community. You know, they helped us create the Executive Order 9066 exhibit, and we made a promise to the Nisei, most all of whom are gone now, that it'd become part of our permanent story featured in the museum, and it's there today. Next. In terms of my own personal journey, I showed the image of my parents and my paternal grandmother in China. You know, at some point in all of our journeys, as you age, you want to find out a little bit more about where you came from. So went back to my father's village in Faosiak, where the Chews are from, and I brought my kids. That's my younger son there. He's now taller than me, but we went into the village, and we found the house where, you know, generations of my family had been. You know, it's kind of interesting. You go back there and everyone kind of looks like you. I noticed, you know, the facial profile and so forth. There's kind of that same strong jawbone and the way you walk. It's just kind of eerie how the genes are kind of pretty strong there. But it was a powerful moment for me, but it was a kind of a full circle in terms of just rediscovering who I was. And I think those are, is that the last image, Ricky? Yep, that's it. So again, those images and many more are in the 700-page book, which again traces the journey that I went through in terms of preserving and rediscovering my own history, and embedding that also with the community's history and the stories of people like my parents. My father was a waiter, you know, he deserved a story. My mother, a sewing woman, she deserved a story. All those folks who are unknown, unrecognized by history, who we have an opportunity to share with a larger audience. Gene, I don't know if you wanted to prompt a few questions or you want me to open things up. Or...
Well, I think you're being really nice to us and you kept your narrative pretty short, but maybe you could quickly, and by the way, to all in the audience, please submit your questions into the chat, and I will basically relay those to Ron as quickly as I can. And I see many familiar faces and out there, so I know that you're not necessarily a quiet audience. You have many good questions, and I see Carrie Galanter. I see you're right there in Seattle, so I know that you might have some questions. But Ron, maybe you could talk a little bit about why Chinese settled in Seattle. You know, how did the community get started in the first place? And then maybe a little bit more about the Kongyik building and what is in there in the museum. I know that you described some of the downstairs store spaces, but what else is upstairs in the museum?
Yeah. Well, I think the story of why Chinese came to the Pacific Northwest is very similar to probably why they came to Los Angeles and San Francisco and a lot of the port cities. You know, back during that time period in you know, late 1800s, early 1900s, you know, there was a lot of poverty, famine, you know, war, instability, and so they came overseas to find a better life. And so that's why my grandfather left, was to make some money and hopefully to send some money to support the family back in China. My grandfather came in 1911. He worked in the salmon canning industry, worked in Chinatown as a dealer in one of the gambling establishments, saved his money, went back periodically to China, had kids, and then when they came of age, meaning they finished school in the village at age 13, they came and worked in America. But they couldn't bring their wives over because of the exclusion law. So it wasn't until 1950 that my parents reunited in America for the first time. Yeah, very similar story as to why they arrived. As far as the building that we redeveloped into a new museum, we felt that that was really an appropriate building to redevelop because of the fact it was deteriorating, and that legacy of what that first generation had done in terms of creating community living spaces was going to be lost. So we felt that it was almost about not simply preserving a building, but excavating and preserving the stories that emerged out of that building, which didn't simply house Chinese laborers, but also in later years, it was run by a Japanese American hotel manager. Japanese Americans lived there. African Americans lived there who worked as porters down at Union Station down the street. There were Italian Americans, Filipino Americans. So it presented an opportunity to present a multi-ethnic story. And, you know, it became a powerful engine for us raising the money to redevelop and preserve it.
But that leads into actually three of the questions that have come in. So how much contact was there between this diverse immigrant community, that including Sikhs, Japanese, Filipinos, and Chinese, and others as time passed? And then how did that help in terms of fundraising for the future museum?
Yeah, that, well, first of all, the Wing Luke Museum is a pan AAPI museum. So it was about incorporating all those stories together. But as we did research, and even you'll see in my book, if you read it, I tried to weave all those stories together because we have a shared history. It's less segregated than people think it is. I remember growing up and working in the restaurant, even that, you know, one of the waiters, he had an African-American wife, you know, and it made for some awkward moments when he went to the family association and Tong meetings. But he also had a wife in China that he couldn't bring here because of exclusion laws. You know, there were people of mixed ancestry who were the offspring. Filipinos worked in the canneries, as did the Chinese, as did the African-American and Japanese-American communities. So there's a lot of intertwining. When the preservation efforts in the neighborhood in the 1960s and 70s began emerging, the student-led efforts, a lot of those are multi-ethnic movements of people from different backgrounds. So yeah, the history is really interwoven.
Was there tension between Chinese and Japanese, especially, let's say, after World War II?
There was, especially among, I'll give you an example. In my family, my mother, you know, because she was in China during the war, you know, and they were attacked by the Japanese, invading the village and so forth, she had a very strong antipathy towards the Japanese Americans here, because she didn't really understand, you know, the difference between Japanese American and Japanese in Japan. On the other hand, my father, you know, a lot of the customers who came to the restaurant where he worked as a waiter were Japanese American, you know, so he befriended a lot of the Japanese Americans, and they invariably left the best tips, you know, of the customers. And so it was a mix, you know. A lot of Chinese Americans who grew up here in the States, who were more Americanized, you know, they got their start in business from properties, businesses that Japanese Americans relinquished to them when they were incarcerated. So again, it's sort of a mixed bag.
Yeah, I think that we have kind of some common experiences down here. I'm sure that if we open up a discussion later on, we'll find the same occurred here in LA. And actually in Little Tokyo here, we had what, 4 or maybe even 5 Chinese restaurants in the neighborhood. And there was a lot of common history and common background. But let me go back to some of the questions. Let's see, Supon asked, did your father belong to a Chinese American organization? And which one? Did he participate in it?
He didn't really participate. I mean, he worked in a hand laundry with his brothers at different times, and then ended up working as a waiter full time. He was working from 10 in the morning till 2. I'm sorry, 10 in the morning till 2 in the morning. So 7 days a week. So he rarely had time to do much. He did participate in the Long Kong Association, which is our family association, just in terms of attending, you know, and bringing us there every year for the New Year's activities. But he didn't really participate in any of the, you know, larger community activities. He was a waiter, you know, but, you know, I gained a lot of strength and knowledge from him because he was, you know, he was very wise about the world in a way that I appreciate now.
Yeah.
Oh, you know, before I forget,
okay.
I'm sorry, Gene. Yeah, one thing I did mention when we spoke before this presentation that I was going to mention, and I'll just do it at this juncture rather than later because I might forget, is, you know, that whole point about, I'm sure, just knowing who's part of this audience, there are others here who have incredible life stories, memoirs in the making, potentially, community stories that you want to gather. And I just wanted to share a few tips that I turned to that enabled me to write this. How does a journalist who writes 800-word stories produce a full memoir that actually is sold surprisingly well? I think there are maybe a couple hundred copies left, and it's done much, much better than I expected. But the hardest thing for me was trying to figure out a voice. Yeah, thank you for that little shout out there. And by the way, 700 pages, don't be intimidated because the chapters are short. They're really short. I remember I'm a journalist, and the print is big for those of us who are vision challenged as we get older.
It's
and
very easy reading especially for a person like me, but also more than 50 pages of photos.
Yeah, and I organized them so that you don't even have to read the book. You could actually read the middle section and the captions, and it almost is kind of a mirror of everything in the book. And you can read the chapters separately because they're sort of almost their own story without having to rely on the others, even though they're interwoven. You'll understand when you actually start reading it. But, you know, so I had to figure out what the voice was and how I'd do this. So I read, I didn't want it to be a standard Asian American scholarly book because I can't write like that. I don't have the skills to do that. And then it would take too long for me to do that. So I went to the library and started reading children's books. And it forced me actually to simplify my mind. So there were no pretensions. I just wrote as simply, as cleanly as I could. And that's much of the challenge. We tend to think too, as we get older, our brains get cluttered with too much stuff. And so we become very indirect. There's all kinds of, you know, ways we want to say things, but just too much information. So that really helped me, you know, is finding some models of, if you want to write it, if you read certain books that mirror the way you want the story to emerge, read those books and just like learn from those folks. So I read children's books. That helped me. The other thing that helped was, and I'm sure some of you who grew up in the pre-internet era, you know, we used to communicate via letters. You know, I'm not really a pack rat, but I did save a lot of paper stuff. So I saved all my letters. So I was able to recreate stories from letters that people wrote. It's not like emails nowadays or texts that you send. They're very abbreviated. I mean, letters were kind of like letters, and particularly people who are out of town or overseas, you know, they describe things. So I was able to recreate scenes through doing that work. I also interviewed quite a few folks to test my memory to make sure that I had things right. So that all enabled me to move through this research, and I just was disciplined, you know, hour or two every day before I go to work. You know, I was working full time at the time. I'm retired now, or semi-retired, but you know, successful writing is about discipline and habit and regimen. It's like brushing your teeth. Just keep doing a little bit every day, and it begins to emerge. And then I had a lot of folks reading. I let people read parts of it as I was writing, and they'd tell me, no, this doesn't make any sense, Ron, or why are you including this chapter? And then I just dumped stuff that didn't resonate with folks. So those are a few keys that you might want to think about in terms of your own writing journey. If any of you later are interested in, you know, talking more about this, I'm happy to help provide my 2 cents if you're interested.
That's really good insight, and I think, like you said, many of us are really at that stage where we start thinking about how can I relay my family story to my son or grandchildren, and oftentimes we just have not been disciplined or haven't really done a good job of collecting all of the information and then put it into a narrative that others can read. So that's a good lesson. And speaking of a family narrative, there's a question here, and that is, how did your parents deal with a long period of separation? Did they, how did they deal with it in their early years of marriage? You know, what was it like for them? Was it challenging to preserve their feelings from afar? It's not like when you have, you know, today we have video calls and FaceTime. How did they get news of each other? How did the wartime affect their communications?
Yeah, I was going to be a little facetious and tell you got to read the book, but I will let you know that it made for a very difficult relationship. You know, because remember, my mother was in the village, you know, didn't speak any English, came here in her 30s, had all of us kids in her 30s, you know, stuck in a sewing factory. My father came when he was 13, so he could sort of migrate over and learn the language more easily. And they had been separated for 10 years, over 10 years, him being in America, she being in China. When they came together, they were strangers, and it made for a very difficult, tumultuous relationship. And I know that happened with a lot of folks because of the Exclusion Act. You know, once you're reunited, well, you're sort of strangers because you haven't really been together, and it was hard. In the case of my family too, after my parents got married in 1937, they actually had a child in the village who died in infancy when my father had returned to America. Now, I didn't know about this till much later, but it was a source of, I think, distress in the relationship. And I was trying to understand it more as an adult, but I think she felt abandoned at a time where she needed that support the most. But it wasn't really his fault. You know, there wasn't any health care in the village, and still didn't know. I mean, to this day, no one really knows why he passed away. But yeah, I had a older brother in China that I didn't know about that my parents kind of hid from us. And so again, it's part of their relationship and the tumultuousness of their relationship. In the book too, it's sort of a funny, I think, poignant chapter about how my mother tried to learn English after she retired from the sewing factory, and how epic her failure was. And it was just kind of, I mean, it's sort of tragic and sad in some ways. There's some twists there, but I was inspired by her perseverance because she tried as hard as she could. She took ESL classes. She was the oldest student in her class, and idioms. She could never figure out these American idioms, you know, and how, you know, and I'm trying to translate the stuff to her, and I'm not quite sure how to translate it. And anyway, there's some really interesting moments that I think you'll people who get the book will appreciate.
I think your Toy-san is just similar to mine. You know, like we're going Hoi-san, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about well, how far or where is Bao Sek located relative to some of the other places? And also, there's a comment from Jessica. We are also a Chu family from Bao Sek. Did your grandparents stay in touch with relatives who were overseas, who might have immigrated to different countries?
Yeah. Boy, a bunch of questions. So when we went back, my sister and we brought our kids back. I have two brothers. We couldn't work out the schedule, and maybe someday we'll all go back. But you know, we went back to the village, and they did correspond regularly with folks back in the village. There were still people who were fairly close, and you know, you go back there and they have the pictures, the Polaroid pictures that, you know, my parents sent back there, you know, on the family altar. So you see these pictures of yourself. You're kind of surprised and stunned that, you know, they know what has been happening because, you know, they kept in touch. And then they also sent money back on a regular basis, you know, like most of the overseas Chinese, to help, you know, build schools and roads and all that kind of stuff. But we had a cousin who was in the village, who has since passed away, who was kind of our guide, took us to the cemeteries, you know, to visit the grave sites and visited all kinds of places. So it was, again, there's a chapter in there that's, again, very personal and meaningful, like what it's like to return as American-born Chinese back to the village, and to see and rediscover this place that provides you a sense of belonging, but that also reminds you that you have one foot in two places. Your heart is not fully in one place or another. But it also reminded me, or kind of gave me a stronger sense of why my mother was always so sad. It's what I describe as this immigrant sorrow that never leaves you. You know, if you leave at an older age, there's something that never leaves you, the sorrow, the sense of loss of place. Um, when my mother in her later years actually went solo back to visit her father's village, the funniest thing, she was in her 70s at the time, um, and had retired, but she came back and she made peace with the fact that she would never go back to China again. And the one thing she complained about was the fact that people were still drying clothing, on the porch outside, and the flies and all the cesspools of, just so the sanitation and having flush toilets were kind of, the thing that sealed it for her. And then also she realized for the first time, her kids and grandkids would die in America. So she made peace that this was her home. But again, there's this immigrant sorrow that I really began to understand during my own journey back to China.
Oh, that's an interesting thought concept. I haven't heard that term before. Immigrant sorrow. That sometimes many people might migrate and not necessarily find the gold mountain.
Yeah.
That could occur. Did your father's or mother's siblings migrate to other places, other countries, or to the U.S.?
My mother's history is mostly more Canada based, Vancouver, Toronto, and possibly some other places. And then my father's is really more Seattle, and from Seattle, some of them moved to the East Coast and down to California and so forth. I don't know that there's any other countries where, there's a great amount of settlement from at least my family clan.
And I forgot to ask, maybe you mentioned it early on and I just didn't hear. What was your grandfather's occupation here?
Oh, as I mentioned, he worked up in Alaska as a cannery worker.
On the canneries.
Yeah, so he was dispatched up to Alaska, and then he worked in Chinatown, Seattle Chinatown, as basically a dealer in a gambling establishment. Because back then, they're all bachelors and they hang out at these association gambling, and that's what he did. So yeah.
Any other questions? I'm looking for more in the chat. Question was, can the book be bought directly from you and get signed? Or do you have an email where we can correspond? We can.
Yes. Well, first of all, the book itself is being sold as a benefit for the International Examiner newspaper, where I served as editor during the first part of my career. It's a nonprofit Asian American newspaper based in Seattle International District, Chinatown. So you could order it from the newspaper. You can go online and order it there.
I did see that. Yeah, I saw it online when I ordered mine. But because I happen to know the museum, I went through them. But
yeah, you could also go through Wing Luke Museum, or and I'm happy to share that. Or you could actually go online. I have a website, Chu Communications, but you could order it directly from me, and I'm happy to personalize the message on the book. And then that way actually goes 100% of the proceeds go directly to the International Examiner.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Wayne has a question. In your travels to other Chinatowns in California or Oregon, what similarities or differences do you see? And for example, Portland has an older history of Chinatown. And by the way, shout out to Angela, who's maybe in Portland right now, one of our board members. For example, Portland has an older Chinatown that there the community has kind of gone downhill, seemingly. What are your thoughts about the changes that have occurred?
Yeah, well, I think it's no secret that many of the Chinatowns throughout the country whether it's Boston, DC, Portland, other places, and even LA, which has gone through obviously an iteration of different Chinatowns in its history. But it's no secret that they're struggling to survive just because of the demographics, gentrification, and more recent years, the issue of crime and, the stability of the community. Seattle has a fighting chance, I think. It's branded itself as an international district because of its multi-ethnic history of, there really wasn't a separate Manila town, even though there's strong Filipino presence. There is and there isn't a little Saigon area. I mean, it's sort of its own community, but it's small enough. And then Nihon Machi, there's a little bit of Nihon Machi, but it's branded itself in many respects as an international district. So it has a fighting chance because of different groups that have banded together. And then a new generation that's starting to move down there. And particularly in this post-pandemic period, and even during the pandemic, a lot of them banded together and began working together to fight back against the anti-Asian hate and to help preserve the economic vitality of the neighborhood. So I'm hopeful for Seattle. I've done some work with the Portland Chinatown Museum over the past several years, working with their board. And so I know some of their challenges, and, that Old Town area is, boy, it's just tough. But, I think I'm hopeful with the next generation emerging that we can preserve these places for another generation, but it's going to be uphill.
The Portland Chinatown Museum is fairly new, isn't it?
Yes, they're going through, I believe, a transitional period. There was a woman who was the backbone of the institution on a staff level for a long, long time, and she's left. And there's a woman who's there on an interim basis, but they have a facility that they have moved into. They do have programs and so forth, but again, there's some financial challenges. And then if you go down to the neighborhood, I mean, the issues of homelessness and safety are really really big and difficult.
Back to Seattle for a moment. I remember taking a tour of the Seattle Underground, and what was were there Chinese who lived in that underground area?
So what Gene is referring to is that there was a Great Seattle Fire, I believe 1889, somewhere around there. I'm forgetting the exact year. But anyway, the city of Seattle burned down. It was near the waterfront. And what happened was literally the whole city burned down. And so they built the new city on top of the old city. So there's an underground, and there's an underground tour that's operated by some private firm. And they've preserved some of those spaces where you literally go under the sidewalk and walk around and so forth. As far as I know, there's no designated Chinatown area that's part of that original city area that's been entombed. There is an old Chinatown near 2nd and Washington Street, which is above ground, and there's some buildings that are part of that original Chinatown that still exist. And you can sort of see one of the buildings that actually has a balcony. It looks very much like that traditional Chinese second, third story balcony. So there's remnants of that early Chinatown near 2nd and Washington Street in Pioneer Square that still exist.
Was there, and I'm still looking for any more questions, but I always have some in my back pocket here. Most of, it sounds like almost all of the population was Toisan or Hoiping, or Siyap people. Were there any Zhongshan or others who might have migrated into the area?
It was almost all Hoisan. I don't know if there were very many folks who didn't speak Hoisanwa, so Um, but again, obviously it's changed a lot. A lot of the, it's interesting because a lot of the people who work in the restaurants now and some of the arrivals now, you know, they're from Hoisan as well. So we've had a resurgence of that population.
Is the Panama Hotel still operating?
It still is. And what Gene is referring to, there's a hotel in the Japantown Nihonmachi area that was preserved. It has in its basement an original Japanese traditional bath. And it also has suitcases from the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, who left their belongings, storing them in the hotel, Panama Hotel, who never came back for those suitcases. So it's kind of almost a slice of history there that's preserved in the basement. The owner, Jan Johnson, does do tours for folks who are interested.
So she's still there.
Yep, she's still there. In fact, I
Okay.
just saw her a couple of days ago. Yeah.
Okay. For those in the audience, my wife and I stayed at the Panama Hotel once, and it was interesting for several days actually, and we enjoyed it. The hotel had been kind of remodeled, and it's one of those where you have to go down the hall to go to the bathroom. So, but it was and it had creaky wooden floors. But it was clean and nice at that time. So, you know, hopefully it still is. I would probably go visit it again. Any others questions? You know, we're kind of reaching the end of our allotted time here. I can actually, well, a couple of quick announcements. Maybe first of all, maybe since I don't see any questions, I'll just sort of thank you, Ron, for your presentation and sharing with us some of your knowledge. I know there's a lot more, and I could probably keep asking, throwing questions your way, and you would have answers. But I just want to thank you on behalf of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California and our community co-sponsor here. Is it really this month? I'm not even sure. The China Society of Southern California regularly has been our community co-sponsor, but I thank them for their support anyway.
Gene,
yeah.
Gene, can I just interrupt? Were there some other questions? I just saw something flash on my screen.
There one?
That there are two other questions or something. I just want to be mindful that I don't
scrolling. Kudos to you and other activists. I mean, that just came in. Okay, I'm sorry. That was a second part that I missed. Okay, there were two. For you and other activists who have sought to preserve Chinatown, having the museum, etc., there is not the community cohesiveness in Portland. Okay, that's the second part to the prior question about the preservation of Portland Chinatown. But here I see another one from Carrie. With the revitalization and rebuilding of the waterfront, could we create a larger community presence there?
That's a good question. I don't know if any of you are familiar with what's going on in Seattle, but the whole waterfront is being rebuilt, essentially. There's going to be a big waterfront park. It's all part of a larger redevelopment of that section of the city. I attended some of the earlier meetings around potential program initiatives, and as far as I know, they haven't picked up on any of these possibilities, but I was advocating for trying to look at some of the history of the waterfront that relates to, for example, the canning industry, the crab canning industry, because a lot of the women that I grew up with that would catch the bus from Beacon Hill, a lot of them worked down in the crab factories. They caught the bus, they wore these big rubber boots, and they smelled really bad when they came back from work. But nobody's really written about that history. A lot of the sewing factories are right down there as well, and there's incredible history there. There's a lot of fishing there that involved I know members of the African American community and Native community, right down near the piers. So there's some interesting opportunities, I think, to explore and really delve into that. But whether that gets implemented in some major kind of way, it's just an open question. So,
You know, I apologize to people who submitted questions. I had to scroll down the chat and I realized I missed a few here. So if no objection, I'm going to continue for a few more minutes here. I think we
and
have,
I'll try to be quick, mindful.
yeah,
of
well, no, I
everyone's
think we have time, so we don't have to rush too much here. There's the Bingkong Tong has a really nice large building. There must have been a lot of members. Was there a powerful Chinese benevolent association, and were they rivals? In other words,
Yeah, well, there are a couple tongs in Seattle that were big. There's the Hop Sing Tong, Hop Sing Hong, and then there's the Bing Kung. They were probably the two biggest. There, the Sui Sing Tong was also had a presence, but back during the Nisqually earthquake, their little storefront cubbyhole collapsed and they never resurfaced. Bing Kung is interesting because they actually own their own building. And so they were able to generate resources from just, basically operating a hotel. And so they've thrived. There's also Hip Sing Tong. So there's like four tongs, actually. Sui Sing has sort of faded away. Hip Sing, I haven't heard much from. So Hop Sing and Bing Kung are the two big ones.
those are names that you hear in places like San Francisco and other Chinatowns. Were there some open conflicts?
I don't know in terms of the early history. There certainly was in the early years, because remember, you had all bachelor men and they the two things they did were gamble and drink and fight one another, and there was a lot of protection and stuff going on. In later years, they became more like, there's still rivalry in terms of trying to get members more than anything, but it's not like open warfare or anything. They became more like lodges. So you go in there and they're watching, Seattle Sonics games or, whatever sports, and playing mahjong and that kind of thing.
They're more social clubs. They're more social clubs today.
Yeah, well, and people who are most active in tongs are usually sort of active in the some of the major family associations as well.
Yeah, there's probably some overlap.
Did you catch them all?
Yeah, here's another question. So regarding, we talked about the Panama Hotel, and Wayne reminds us of a well-known book, On the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. That was a book written about the Panama Hotel, the relationship between the Japanese and the Filipinos and the Chinese during the war. So,
yeah, great book. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see here. And thank you, Carrie, for reminding me. There are some other questions here. When will the audio book come out?
Well, this is interesting for any of you who maybe want to tinker with maybe doing an audiobook. I think there's a strong interest in, a lot of folks who have visual impairments or just are more suited to listening to their books rather than reading them. We'll have an opportunity to listen to my book soon, hopefully later this year. There's 70 chapters. I'm currently on chapter 62 of the recording. It's hard work, but yeah, it'll be available through the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library for free, and it'll also be available. I'm sure we'll make it available for sale as well.
We're looking forward to that. Did you have any connection with the Reconciliation Park in Tacoma? Chinese were driven out from Tacoma way back, and apparently the city of Tacoma has apologized and created a park. Did you have anything to do with that?
I wasn't directly involved in that. Uh, the history of Seattle and Tacoma are sort of different. In Tacoma, they basically drove the Chinese out during the exclusion period in 1885, riots and so forth. Chinese were driven out, Chinatown was burned down, and it really never came back till more recent years. So there's that loss of continuity. In Seattle, there was resistance in the following year, 1886. Chinese were driven out, and there's a riot. Federal troops were called in, martial law, and so forth. But the Chinese managed to stay and keep a foothold. Some of the Chinese who worked as servants and a few of the business people were able to stay, and so they maintained that continuity of presence, and so the community never left. But there was a recognition of what happened in Tacoma and a memorial park that's worth a visit. To understand that history. In Seattle, we've had even more recently commemoration of what happened in Seattle that's held in the Chinatown International District area. And there was a fairly large commemoration this past year in wake of a lot of anti-Asian violence in the area. And Betty Luke, Wing Luke's younger sister, has been at the forefront of those efforts. I write about that also in my book as well.
So tell us about anti-Asian violence in Seattle. Have there been incidents?
The final chapter of my book, actually, I finished the book and then George Floyd murder happened, and then the pandemic. So I tacked on fairly quickly a final chapter that brought it up to date. But yeah, during that time period when the pandemic, I remember even going on runs on Beacon Hill, fairly Asian neighborhood, and being verbally assaulted by folks. This is after Trump, began fanning the flames with some of his language. In Chinatown International District, there were white supremacist groups who stickered certain areas of the neighborhood. And so, we've had our share as well. But I'm reminded as well, in these areas, these Chinatowns, these Asian neighborhoods, the elderly have always been prey. So was there an increase, or are we just recognizing it more? Because, a lot of the elderly who live in the neighborhood, they get robbed, because they're usually carrying cash. And so it's been an ongoing issue, public safety, the safety of our elders.
Well, you can't retire. Your work is not done yet.
Well, none of our work is ever done. I'm committed to working with the next generation in terms of trying to deal with a lot of these issues.
I'm going to note for our audience that Carrie has posted in the chat a couple of links to the Chinese Reconciliation Park Foundation in Tacoma. And there's a Tacoma Fuzhou Sister City organization that's been very active. Upcoming events, opera, movie in March at the Asia Pacific Cultural Center on South Tacoma Way. So while I comment on the others, maybe you all can look in the chat and copy down those links. Another question for you, Ron, from Sadie. What influenced you to become an activist?
I grew up in that era of 60s and 70s when many of us who were, on college campuses were inspired by the African-American civil rights movement. And it was also the height of the women's movement and the Asian American movement. And so coming from the background that I did, I'm beginning to learn about the Chinese Exclusion Act and, a lot of those other issues, the poverty and the community. Um, you start realizing that you have a voice. I grew up working in the restaurant and saw how my father was treated, saw how my mother was treated. You put the piece together and you want to fight for change. So that's really what inspired me.
I think the reason why many of us are so interested in our history is that we want to understand how and why, or how our forebears were able to survive and make it through some of the adverse situations that they encountered in our history. And we talk about the greatest generation and how people went through exclusion, went through war and restrictive covenants and all sorts of challenges. And I know that many of us here just marvel when we hear some of these stories from people, how they are able to make it through, or how they made the best of it for themselves. And I have a sense that, in just reading through here, reading through your book, I got a sense of, and I'm not plugging the book here, I just got a sense of how resilient many of us had to be to make it through. Not that, I know that I can tell you that for many of us, we led a relatively comfortable life, but a generation back, it was there were different challenges that people faced.
The other thing, if I might just jump in,
Sure.
That another thing I wanted to do, why I did the book, there have been quite a few books on Chinese American experience from all kinds of generations, so forth. But I never saw a book that really mirrored the experience of the Hoi San Yin. They're mostly Cantonese or more recent arrivals, Mandarin speaking and so forth. So I intentionally wanted to capture the language of Chinatown, both in the characters and in the words, in the way that we say things. So that's kind of, I always felt this conundrum. It's kind of like, well, you take an Asian American Studies class and you would somehow have the impression, well, all of us are Cantonese. Well, we're not Cantonese. I mean, most of us in the early years were not Cantonese at all. We came from the village. We spoke a very different dialect. And, people have said, well, it's not really a dialect. It's Cantonese, but it's a different kind of Cantonese. No, it's its own language. So I wanted to assert the validity of our experience and to convey that sense of what it was like, in that era of the exclusion law too, because, people had paper identities. What did that mean in terms of the conversations we had and how we viewed ourselves and how our parents reacted to situations? So I wanted to capture some of that because I didn't feel that was fully explored in other books. And then also just there's this heightened interest in Chinese cuisine nowadays, and everyone's a foodie now. But I wanted to write about the people who worked in the restaurants and give them a face and name. So I tell about these people because to me that's more important than the food. I mean, you can go online or do your own sampling of food. Food is what it is, but there was an era where we created a cuisine, this chop suey, dak suey food that was uniquely our food that allowed us to survive and was resourceful and so forth. So I wanted to document that in this period. Dim sum, we didn't call it dim sum, we called it cha ngao, and there's only certain varieties of things that we made in the restaurants. So I want to document that. So there's a loss of memory of a lot of these things, and I just wanted to validate, well, hey, this is our experience, a little different from what came later. But to surface that for me was one of the goals.
Well, you know, every day is a learning experience. And I can tell you, my wife and I went to pick up some dim sum at a local hole-in-the-wall restaurant. I had not been to before, but I saw the Yelp reviews. So I went in and I said, okay, well, I'll order some of this dim sum. And the man who took the order spoke perfect Hoisanwa. So I said, oh, I saw him. I said, yeah, Hoisan Nima. And he said, yeah. So, whether it's behind the fish counter or in the supermarket or at the local restaurant, we find our Toisan, Hoisan folks everywhere, all across the country. And this is sort of an amazing phenomenon that maybe, Ron, we could work together and try to tie all of this together. It's just an amazing diaspora that we've been a part of. And I just can't tell you, how many thousands of journeys that how many stories that remain to be told. Anyway, I've pretty much gone through the questions. We're past time, and I know that we all have other things that we need to do. I want to ask everyone to provide a round of applause or standing ovation for Ron. Thank you for sharing your story. We really appreciate your breadth of knowledge, and 600 pages here is or 700 pages is not enough, actually. We know that there's more coming, so we look forward to that, and hopefully we can learn even more. And for those who have not been to the Wing Book Museum, I would really recommend that a visit to Seattle just to see that, because by walking through and seeing the commercial spaces and also the living quarters of the people who actually lived in those Kongyik buildings, gives you a really a good sense of how the community lived, or what it looked like in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, and with that, thank you, Ron. I do want to make a quick announcement, a couple of quick announcements. The Chinese Historical Society of Southern California has been working with a planning team to schedule our upcoming Yosemite pilgrimage. This year, we're going to split up the program into two different parts. The backpack to Sing Peak will be at its regular schedule or regular time in July. This time it'll be July 16th through 18th. That's a 3-day backpacking trip for those of you who have not been to Yosemite or that part of Yosemite at the southern edge. Sing Peak is a mountain that's 10,552 feet in elevation. It's named after Tai Sing, the mountain chef, the head chef for the U.S. Geological Survey in the late 1800s, who led the Mather Mountain Party, which led to the formation of the National Park Service. There's a whole story, so come to the Historical Society website to learn more about Tai Sing, chssc.org. But our main pilgrimage will be in Wawona at the southern part of Yosemite, and it's scheduled for October 6th and 7th, a Friday and Saturday. We generally meet or gather, arrive the night before Thursday, in this case, October 5th, and then we would depart on the Sunday, which would be October 8th. So it's basically 2 full days plus a portion of 2 other days that we'll be able to experience and learn about the role of early Chinese in Yosemite, whether it's working in the forests or building trails or working in the hotels and doing the laundry. Some of you who are not aware, the early Chinese laundry was sort of rediscovered a few years ago as being used as, excuse me, as a storage shed. And the Yosemite and the National Park Service and the Yosemite Conservancy, and with a couple of generous grants, have reconverted that storage shed into the Chinese laundry, or at least into a Chinese laundry exhibit, which happened to serve the Wawona Hotel and as well as other buildings in the area. So we will, we hope that you can go to our website, chssc.org, and sign up for the Yosemite pilgrimage, October 6th and 7th. And with that, I'll close the evening. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in. I can't thank all of the people who joined in today, but it's good to see your names and faces, and hopefully I'll see you in person again.